Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history of Fort Worth, Texas. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard the story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. In the dusty archives of Tarrant County, there exists a collection of documents that few have ever accessed. Yellowed newspaper clippings, faded journal entries, and official records that tell a tale so unsettling that for decades it remained merely a whispered legend among the oldest families of Fort Worth. What happened during the autumn of 1875 at the Harvest Fair would forever change how the growing settlement viewed the hospitality of the Blackwood sisters. The annual Harvest Fair of 1875 was meant to be a celebration of abundance, a gathering where the hard-working settlers of Fort Worth and surrounding homesteads could enjoy the fruits of their labor before the coming winter. Instead, it became the beginning of a mystery that would haunt the region for generations. The fair was held on the outskirts of town, where the newly constructed Texas and Pacific Railway would soon bring even more settlers to the burgeoning cattle town. It was a time of prosperity, of growth. Fort Worth was transforming from a frontier outpost into a proper city. Among the most anticipated attractions at every harvest fair were the food stalls, and none more so than the one operated by the Blackwood sisters. Agatha and Eleanor Blackwood had arrived in Fort Worth in 1871, 2 years after the railroad reached the city. They purchased a modest property on the eastern edge of town, where they established what quickly became known as the finest butcher shop in the county. Their meat pies were particularly renowned, with a flavor so distinctive that people would travel from as far as Dallas just to purchase them. The sisters were not young women when they arrived. Both were in their 40s, unmarried, and intensely private. Agatha, the elder by 3 years, handled the business affairs and customer interactions. She was described in contemporary accounts as stern but fair, with eyes that seemed to evaluate more than your ability to pay. Eleanor, by contrast, rarely appeared in the shop. She was the butcher, the cook, the creator of those famous recipes. On the rare occasions when someone glimpsed her through the back door of the shop, they described a thin woman with surprisingly strong hands and an expression of complete concentration. What few people knew was that before arriving in Fort Worth, the Blackwood sisters had lived briefly in 5 other growing settlements across the Midwest and South. According to records discovered in 1964 by historian Margaret Wilcox, the sisters had operated butcher shops in each location, always moving on after approximately 2 years. Wilcox's research was never published. Her notes indicate that she was planning a comprehensive article on female business owners in post-Civil War Texas, but the project was abandoned after she suffered what official records describe as a nervous collapse. Her husband later claimed that she had become obsessed with the Blackwood sisters to the point of refusing to eat meat. She died in a sanitarium in 1966. The fair of 1875 began on October 15th, a Thursday. The weather was unseasonably warm, with a dry wind blowing in from the west. The sisters' stall was centrally located, with a hand-painted sign promising meat pies that will haunt your dreams. By all accounts, business was brisk from the moment the fair opened. The sisters had brought a quantity of pies that should have lasted the entire 3-day event, but by Friday evening, they were selling the last of their stock. It was around this time that the first disappearance occurred. Thomas Kerrigan, a 38-year-old cattle driver who had arrived with a herd from San Antonio, was last seen at the Blackwood sisters' stall on Friday evening. According to witness statements given later, Kerrigan had been drinking heavily throughout the day and had gotten into arguments with several local men. When he approached the Blackwood stall, he was loud and belligerent, demanding service even though there was a line of waiting customers. Agatha Blackwood reportedly stepped forward and said something to him that wasn't overheard by others in line. Whatever she said, it appeared to calm Kerrigan immediately. He nodded, stepped away from the line, and was observed walking with Agatha toward the back of the fairgrounds. Neither returned to the stall that evening. Eleanor continued serving customers alone, explaining that her sister was seeing to a special order. When questioned later, Eleanor claimed that after speaking with Kerrigan, Agatha had directed him to their home to pick up additional pies that had been reserved for special customers. According to Eleanor, her sister had then returned to their property to prepare these pies for the final day of the fair. No one reported seeing Agatha again at the fair that night, which aligned with Eleanor's account. Kerrigan was not immediately missed. It was common for cattle drivers to complete their business and move on, or to spend days in the saloons and brothels that had proliferated in Fort Worth as it grew into a major stop on the cattle trails. It was only when his employer came looking for him the following week, seeking to hire him for another drive, that anyone realized he had vanished. By then, the fair was long over, and the Blackwood sisters had returned to their regular business. When questioned by the town marshal, Robert Hutchinson, they expressed surprise at Kerrigan's disappearance. Agatha stated firmly that while she had indeed spoken to the man and directed him to their home for the reserved pies, he had never arrived. She suggested that, given his inebriated state, he might have wandered off, fallen into the Trinity River, or simply decided to move on without informing his employer. Marshal Hutchinson found no reason to disbelieve the respected businesswoman. His report, filed on October 27, 1875, concludes, "No evidence of foul play. Subject Thomas Kerrigan likely departed voluntarily or met with accident due to intoxication. The case might have ended there, were it not for the second disappearance." On November 12th, less than a month after the fair, Evelyn Murray, a 29-year-old widow who had recently moved to Fort Worth to live with her brother's family, visited the Blackwood butcher shop. According to her sister-in-law's later testimony, Murray had been enthusiastic about trying the famous meat pies after hearing about them at the fair, which she had not attended. Murray left her brother's home at approximately 10 a.m. The Blackwood shop was a 15-minute walk away. When she had not returned by dinner time, her brother, William Murray, became concerned and went to look for her. The Blackwood shop was closed, though it normally remained open until 6 p.m. William Murray reported knocking on the door, but receiving no answer. He returned home, hoping his sister had gone elsewhere, perhaps to visit a new acquaintance. By the next morning, when Evelyn had still not returned, William Murray reported her missing to Marshal Hutchinson. The marshal visited the Blackwood shop, which was open for business as usual. Agatha expressed surprise at hearing of Murray's disappearance, claiming that while several women had visited the shop the previous day, she did not recall anyone matching Murray's description. "It was unusually busy yesterday," Agatha reportedly told the marshal. "Perhaps she came and left without making a purchase. Or perhaps she intended to visit but changed her mind." The marshal noted that Agatha seemed perfectly at ease during questioning, maintaining eye contact and showing appropriate concern. Eleanor, as usual, remained in the back of the shop, though the marshal reported hearing the rhythmic sound of a cleaver striking a butcher block throughout his conversation with Agatha. For several weeks, there was no progress in either investigation. Then, in early December, a young boy exploring along the banks of the Trinity River found a man's boot containing what was confirmed to be a human foot. The boot was identified by Kerrigan's employer as being similar to those worn by the missing cattle driver, though he could not make a definitive identification. This discovery prompted Marshal Hutchinson to take a more thorough look at both disappearances. He noted in his personal journal, which was donated to the Tarrant County Historical Society in 1925 by his granddaughter, that he found it troubling that both missing persons had connections to the Blackwood sisters. "While there is no direct evidence of wrongdoing," he wrote, "the coincidence cannot be ignored. I intend to learn more about these women." Hutchinson began by making inquiries about the sisters' background. He sent telegrams to the towns where they had previously lived, requesting information about their time there and any unusual occurrences. The responses, which took weeks to arrive, were uniformly unremarkable. The sisters had operated respectable businesses, paid their taxes, and left without incident. In one location, Jackson, Mississippi, They had been particularly well regarded for donating meat pies to a community gathering following a devastating fire. What was not mentioned in these official responses, but later discovered in newspaper archives from these towns, was that each community had experienced unexplained disappearances during the time the Blackwood sisters resided there. In Jackson, 3 people had vanished over an 18-month period. In Springfield, Missouri, where the sisters had lived from 1868 to 1870, 4 individuals had disappeared without trace. None of these cases had been solved, and apparently no one had connected them to the respected businesswomen. As winter settled over Fort Worth, the investigations stalled. No further trace of Thomas Kerrigan was found, and Evelyn Murray seemed to have vanished without a trace. The Blackwood sisters continued their business, though some residents later reported that they began to avoid the shop, unsettled by the rumors that had started to circulate. The winter of 1875-76 was particularly harsh in Texas. Heavy snowfall and bitter cold kept many residents indoors for weeks at a time. During this period, the Blackwood sisters' business actually increased. With fresh meat in short supply, their preserved products became essential. People set aside their unease in favor of practicality. Their meat pies, sausages, and cured hams helped many families through the difficult months. Some accounts from this period mention a subtle change in the sisters' demeanor. Agatha, normally reserved and businesslike, became almost gregarious, engaging customers in conversation and offering unsolicited advice about the best ways to prepare their purchases. Eleanor began to appear in the front of the shop more frequently, watching customers with what was described as keen interest. One customer, Martha Jenkins, later told Marshall Hutchinson that Eleanor had asked her detailed questions about her family, how many children she had, whether her husband was often away on business, whether they had relatives nearby. It was not until February of 1876 that the case took an unexpected turn. A severe storm struck Fort Worth, with high winds damaging several structures. The Blackwood property suffered significant damage to the roof of a storage shed behind the main building. Marshall Hutchinson, who happened to be passing by during the storm, offered assistance and was one of several men who helped secure a tarp over the damaged section. While on the property, Hutchinson noted something unusual about the layout. According to the property records, the Blackwood plot should have contained a small smokehouse, but there was no such structure visible. When he inquired about this, Agatha explained that they had demolished the old smokehouse shortly after purchasing the property, preferring to use more modern methods for preserving their meats. Hutchinson might have accepted this explanation, but later that same evening he was approached by one of the other men who had helped with the repairs, a carpenter named Samuel Hayes. Hayes confided that while securing the tarp, he had noticed freshly turned earth behind the shed in an area that would have been hidden from view from both the street and neighboring properties. What caught his attention was not the disturbed soil itself, which could have been explained as a garden plot, but rather the presence of what appeared to be a metal handle protruding from the ground, similar to the type used on cellar doors. Hayes also mentioned something else that troubled him. While working on the roof, he had glimpsed through a small window into a part of the Blackwood home that was not visible from the street. He described seeing walls lined with what appeared to be medical texts and anatomical drawings. Not the sort of thing you'd expect in a butcher's home, he told Hutchinson, more like a doctor's study. This information prompted Hutchinson to conduct a more thorough investigation of the property. He obtained a search warrant from the local magistrate, citing the disappearances and Hayes's observation as justification. On February 12, 1876, Hutchinson arrived at the Blackwood property with 3 deputies. According to his official report, the sisters received them with apparent calm, though he noted that Eleanor's hands trembled slightly as she wiped them on her apron. The search began in the shop itself, where nothing unusual was found. The living quarters behind the shop were Spartan but clean. In a small study, Hutchinson found the medical texts Hayes had mentioned. When questioned about them, Agatha explained that Eleanor had once been married to a doctor who had died during the Civil War. The books had been his, and she had kept them out of sentiment. This explanation seemed plausible enough, though Hutchinson noted that most of the books showed signs of regular use, with bookmarks and annotations in the margins. It was only when they reached the area behind the shed that Hutchinson's suspicions were aroused. The ground did indeed show signs of recent digging, though a thin layer of snow partially obscured the evidence. When questioned, Agatha explained that they had been burying meat scraps and bones, a common practice. Hutchinson ordered his men to dig. After removing approximately 2 feet of soil, they uncovered a wooden trapdoor with a metal handle, the one that Hayes had glimpsed. Agatha protested, claiming it was merely an old root cellar that they rarely used. Hutchinson insisted on opening it. What they found below was a carefully constructed chamber, approximately 10 feet by 12 feet, with walls lined in stone and a packed earth floor. A lantern hung from a ceiling beam, and shelves along one wall held an assortment of knives, cleavers, and saws. In the center of the room was a large wooden table with leather straps attached to each corner. The floor sloped slightly toward a drain in the center. The chamber was empty of any human remains, though Hutchinson reported that it had been recently cleaned, with the scent of lye soap still detectable. When confronted with this discovery, Agatha maintained that the chamber was used for butchering and processing larger animals, explaining that they occasionally purchased whole cattle or pigs directly from local ranchers. The straps, she said, were for securing the carcasses during processing. "It may seem unusual," she told Hutchinson, "but it allows us to work more efficiently. The underground location keeps the meat cool, even in summer. Many butchers have similar arrangements." One of the deputies, a man named Wilson, who had worked briefly as a butcher's assistant before joining the marshal's office, confirmed that such underground workrooms were not unheard of, though he noted that the straps seemed unnecessarily robust for animal carcasses. Unconvinced but lacking definitive evidence of wrongdoing, Hutchinson ordered a more thorough search of the property. It was during this second phase of the investigation that one of the deputies made a grim discovery. Behind a false wall in the main cellar beneath the house, they found a collection of personal items: a pocket watch, a woman's brooch, several rings, and a small leather-bound diary. The diary belonged to Evelyn Murray, identified by her name inscribed on the first page. The final entry, dated November 12th, read, "I am looking forward to finally trying the famous Blackwood meat pies today. Perhaps I will learn what makes them so uniquely delicious." The sisters are said to be quite selective about who they share their recipes with, but as a fellow widow making my way in the world, I hope they might see me as a kindred spirit. In the same hidden space, they discovered a ledger book with entries dating back to the sisters' arrival in Fort Worth. Each entry included a date, a name or description, and various notations that appeared to be weights or measurements. The final entry, dated January 18, 1876, read, "J. Miller, drummer, 164 lbs. Excellent condition. Yield, 72 lbs." Confronted with this evidence, the Blackwood sisters' composure finally broke. According to Hutchinson's report, Eleanor collapsed into a chair, while Agatha stood rigidly, her face expressionless. "You don't understand," she reportedly said. "We provide a service. We give purpose to those who have none." When Hutchinson asked directly if they had killed Kerrigan and Murray, Agatha neither confirmed nor denied it. Instead, she said, "What we do is no different from what the butchers of cattle do. Is a man's life worth more than a cow's simply because he walks on 2 legs? All flesh returns to the earth eventually. We merely facilitate the process and ensure nothing goes to waste." The sisters were immediately arrested and held in the town jail. Word of their arrest spread quickly through Fort Worth, and a crowd gathered outside the jail that evening. Marshal Hutchinson, fearing vigilante justice, stationed extra guards and appealed for calm. In his journal, he wrote that what disturbed him most was not the angry shouts from some members of the crowd, but the silence of others, particularly those who had been regular customers of the Blackwood shop. They stand there, not in protest, not in support, but as if trying to reckon, with what they have consumed. The following day, a more comprehensive search of the Blackwood property was conducted. Investigators dug up the entire yard behind the shed, eventually uncovering human remains. According to the official report, they found bones from at least 7 individuals, though due to the condition of the remains, exact identification proved difficult. The bones showed clear signs of having been stripped of flesh with precise professional cuts. Among the remains, they were able to identify Thomas Kerrigan from a distinctive belt buckle and Evelyn Murray from dental records compared to her brother's description. The other remains were never identified, though Hutchinson speculated in his journal that they might have been travelers or individuals without strong local connections, people who would not be immediately missed. In the root cellar beneath the main house, investigators found a more disturbing scene. A series of large crocks contained various preserved meats in brine. A meat grinder had been recently used and cleaned. Most telling was a set of recipe cards found in a tin box, written in Eleanor's precise hand. The recipes were for various meat dishes with unusual ingredients and preparation methods. One, titled simply Special Pie Filling, included notes about the best cuts to use and suggestions for seasoning based on the source. A search of the sisters' business records revealed another disturbing pattern. After each disappearance in Fort Worth, there had been a marked increase in meat sales, particularly of their famous pies. Similar spikes in business had occurred in each of the previous towns where they had operated, always coinciding with reported missing persons. During their interrogation, Eleanor eventually broke down and provided a full confession. According to the transcript, which was sealed by court order until 1952, the sisters had begun their gruesome practice in 1868, shortly after the death of Eleanor's husband. Facing destitution and with few options available to unmarried or widowed women at that time, they had turned to an unthinkable solution. It began with necessity, Eleanor reportedly stated. A drifter attacked Agatha behind our first shop in Missouri. I killed him defending her. We had nothing. We're about to lose everything. The meat in our shop had spoiled. We were desperate. Eleanor described how they had processed the attacker's body using the butchering skills she had learned from her husband, who had briefly operated a meat market before becoming a doctor. We didn't intend to sell it at first, she claimed, but then our supply ran low again, and we had already crossed that line. It became easier the second time. From that first opportunistic act, the sisters had developed a methodology. They targeted individuals who were unlikely to be missed, drifters, solitary travelers, and occasionally, like Evelyn Murray, newcomers who had not yet established deep connections in the community. They would lure these individuals to their property with various pretexts, kill them quickly in their underground chamber, and process the remains to supplement their legitimate meat supplies. No one ever noticed, Eleanor confessed. In fact, people praised the unique flavor of our products. We provided for ourselves and created something people desired. Is that not the American way? To build something from nothing? When asked how many people they had killed over the years, Eleanor could not or would not provide an exact number. I stopped counting after 20, she said. It became just another part of the business, like slaughtering any other animal. Throughout the interrogation, Agatha remained largely silent, speaking only to correct details of Eleanor's account or to provide clarification about their methods. She showed no remorse, no emotion at all. When asked directly why they had done it, she replied simply, "Because we could." The psychological evaluation of the sisters, conducted by Dr. Joseph Bennett, a physician from Dallas who had studied briefly in Europe with early practitioners of psychological medicine, concluded that both women suffered from a profound moral insensitivity. They understand the social prohibitions against their actions, Bennett wrote, but feel no compulsion to adhere to them. They view humans as we might view livestock, as resources to be utilized rather than beings deserving of empathy or dignity. The trial of the Blackwood sisters was held in March of 1876 and was the most sensational legal proceeding in Fort Worth's young history. Despite efforts by the court to maintain decorum, the case became a public spectacle. Newspapers from as far away as New York sent reporters to cover what they called the Butcher Sisters of Texas, or the Harvest Fair Horrors. The prosecution presented the physical evidence, the underground chamber, the human remains, the personal effects of the victims. The defense, appointed by the court, attempted to argue that the sisters were mentally unsound, victims themselves of circumstance and societal limitations placed on women of their era. The most damning testimony came from former customers who described the distinctive taste of the Blackwood sisters' meat pies. "Unlike anything I've ever tasted," one witness stated, "a sweetness to it that I've never found in beef or pork." Several witnesses became visibly ill on the stand as they realized what they had likely consumed. On March 25, 1876, after deliberating for less than 3 hours, the jury returned a verdict of guilty of murder in the first degree for both Agatha and Eleanor Blackwood. They were sentenced to death by hanging, the execution to be carried out on April 15th. The night before their scheduled execution, something unexpected occurred. The sisters, who were being held in separate cells, somehow managed to obtain poison. By morning, both were dead. No one ever determined how they acquired the poison, though rumors implicated everyone from a sympathetic female visitor to a deputy with financial ties to their business. In their joint suicide note, found in Agatha's cell, they wrote only, "We served this town faithfully. In time, perhaps our contribution will be understood. What we created brought joy to so many." The aftermath of the Blackwood case had profound effects on Fort Worth. The butcher shop was demolished, the property left vacant for decades. The Harvest Fair was not held again until 1890, and even then, many older residents refused to attend. The consumption of meat pies in the region fell dramatically, with many restaurants and bakeries removing them from their offerings entirely. Many of those who had been regular customers of the Blackwood shop reported nightmares, digestive issues, and in some cases, what we might now recognize as symptoms of post-traumatic stress. Several sought treatment at sanitariums or through religious counseling. A few left Fort Worth entirely, unable to continue living in a place where such horrors had occurred and where they had unwittingly participated in them. Over time, the story faded from common knowledge, becoming little more than a whispered legend. The official records were sealed by court order until 1952, ostensibly to protect the reputation of the growing city and the families of those involved. When the records were finally opened to researchers, they received relatively little attention. America was focused on the future, not on gruesome tales from its frontier past. The most comprehensive study of the case was undertaken by Professor James Thornton of Texas Christian University in 1963. His research included interviews with descendants of witnesses and officials involved in the case, as well as analysis of the physical evidence that had been preserved. Thornton's work was never published in full form, however. According to department records, he took an unexpected early retirement in 1964, moved to Colorado, and reportedly refused to discuss the Blackwood case for the remainder of his life. In a letter to a colleague dated January 1964, Thornton wrote, "The deeper I dig into this matter, the more I am convinced that what we are dealing with is not merely a historical curiosity, but a fundamental challenge to our understanding of human nature." The Blackwood sisters were not monsters in the conventional sense. They were businesswomen who simply extended the logic of commerce and consumption to its most terrible conclusion. What disturbs me most is not their actions, but how readily the community accepted their products, how eagerly they consumed what was offered without questioning its source. In 1968, during excavation for a new building on the site where the Blackwood shop once stood, workers uncovered additional human remains that had been missed in the original investigation. These bones, like the others, showed signs of professional butchering. They were quietly reburied in an unmarked section of Oakwood Cemetery. Among the items recovered during this excavation was a small tin box containing what appeared to be recipes and business notes. Most had deteriorated beyond legibility, but one partially preserved page contained what seemed to be a list of preferred characteristics for the sisters' victims. The list included notes about age, health, and occupation, with specific attention to diet and exercise habits. It suggested a level of calculation that went beyond opportunistic predation to something more systematic, almost scientific in its approach. What makes the Blackwood case particularly disturbing is not just the nature of their crimes, but the community's unwitting participation in them. For years, the people of Fort Worth quite literally consumed the evidence, praising the unique flavor of the sisters' products. How many unsuspecting customers became inadvertent cannibals? The court records do not provide a clear answer, but the sisters' business was substantial, with their pies in particularly high demand. Consider the psychological implications for those who learn the truth. How does one reconcile the memory of enjoyment with the knowledge of what caused it? Several contemporary accounts describe customers who, upon learning the nature of the Blackwood sisters' business, experienced violent physical reactions, vomiting, fainting, even seizures in one documented case. The mind's rejection of such knowledge manifests physically when the truth becomes too horrific to process. Even more unsettling is the consideration of how long they might have continued had circumstances not forced Marshall Hutchinson to take a closer look at their property. The sisters had successfully operated in multiple communities before Fort Worth, leaving only when they chose to, not because of suspicion. Their method of selecting victims who would not be immediately missed proved effective. It was only the coincidence of two disappearances connected to them within a short period that raised concerns. The Blackwood case raises uncomfortable questions about the nature of commerce and consumption in rapidly developing communities. Fort Worth in the 1870s was experiencing explosive growth, with new residents arriving daily. In such an environment, anonymity becomes possible. People become faces in a crowd rather than known individuals. The social bonds that might have made the Blackwood sisters' activities impossible in a smaller, more stable community were weakened by the very progress the city celebrated. In his unfinished manuscript, Professor Thornton wrote, "The horror of the Blackwood case lies not in its uniqueness, but in its plausibility. Given the right circumstances, isolation, necessity, opportunity, and a certain fundamental alienation from human empathy, how many might follow a similar path? The sisters were not supernatural monsters, but women who made a series of choices, each one taking them further from conventional morality, but closer to economic success. The legacy of the Blackwood sisters lingers in subtle ways in modern Fort Worth. Older establishments in the Stockyards district still refuse to serve meat pies, though few employees could explain exactly why. For decades, parents warned children not to accept food from strangers with a phrase that originated from this case. Remember the harvest fair. The block where the Blackwood property once stood remained undeveloped until the 1950s, unusual in a rapidly growing city. Some local historians have suggested that the Blackwood case influenced the development of food safety regulations in Texas. The state legislature passed several laws in the late 1870s requiring more rigorous inspection of meat processing facilities. While these laws were not explicitly linked to the case in public discourse, the timing suggests a connection. In the archives of the Tarrant County Historical Society, there is a small collection of items related to the case. Among them is a handwritten recipe book recovered from the Blackwood home. Most pages contain ordinary recipes for breads, cakes, and traditional meat dishes, but the final pages were torn out. According to the inventory list, these missing pages were removed by court order and destroyed. Also in the collection is a letter from a woman named Sarah Billings, dated 1912. Billings identifies herself as having been a neighbor of the Blackwood sisters. She writes, "I have carried this knowledge for too many years. I must confess that I suspected something was amiss long before their arrest. Twice I saw them leading strangers to their home after dark. Twice I heard sounds that no slaughterhouse would produce. I said nothing. May God forgive me, I said nothing, and others died because of my silence. Some questions about the case remain unanswered. The exact number of victims will never be known. The sisters' activities before arriving in the Midwest are undocumented. Most significantly, perhaps, is the question of why their products were so exceptionally popular. Was it merely skilled preparation, unusual seasoning, or something more fundamentally unsettling about human appetite and the taboos that govern it? A tantalizing clue exists in Eleanor Blackwood's medical background. Among the books found in their home were several on chemistry and pharmacology. Some researchers have suggested that the sisters may have incorporated mild addictive substances into their products, ensuring customers would return. This theory remains speculative, as any such compounds would have long since degraded in the preserved samples. In 1965, a folklorist recorded an interview with Martha Simmons, who was 102 years old at the time and had lived in Fort Worth her entire life. As a young girl, she had attended the fateful Harvest Fair of 1875. When asked about the Blackwood sisters, she fell silent for nearly a full minute before responding. "Mother wouldn't let us eat their pies," she finally said. "Said they were too dear, but I remember the smell. Nothing ever smelled quite like that again. Sometimes I dream about it still. I wake up hungry." Her testimony speaks to the sensory impact of the case on those who lived through it. The smell, the taste, these memories persisted long after the facts had been obscured by time. The body remembers what the mind might prefer to forget. The psychological dimensions of the case continue to fascinate modern researchers. Dr. Eleanor Harkness, a criminal psychologist who examined the case records in 1985, suggested that the sisters represented an unusual form of shared psychopathy. "What makes this case unique," she wrote, "is that we have two individuals who not only participated in these acts, but appears to have been equally committed to them. Typically, in partner killings, one individual is dominant and the other submissive. The Blackwood sisters appear to have been true equals in their enterprise. The property where the Blackwood shop once stood is now occupied by a modern office building. Employees occasionally report unexplained cold spots and the phantom scent of baking. In the basement level, used mainly for storage, night security guards have reported hearing the rhythmic sound of a cleaver striking wood, though they never find anyone there when they investigate. These ghost stories, while likely apocryphal, speak to the way the case continues to resonate in the collective imagination of Fort Worth. The idea that such evil could exist behind a respectable facade, that it could operate openly for years without detection, challenges our assumptions about community and safety. Perhaps the most enduring aspect of the Blackwood legacy is how it reveals the thin veneer of civilization that covered the frontier communities of post-Civil War America. Fort Worth in 1875 was transforming from a rough outpost to a proper city, eager to shed its wild past and embrace progress. The Blackwood sisters, with their respectable business and refined manners, seemed to embody that very transformation. That they concealed such darkness beneath that respectable facade serves as a reminder that progress and civilization are sometimes merely performances, masks worn to conceal our more primitive natures. The case also highlights the vulnerability of transient populations in developing communities. Most of the identified victims were people passing through, travelers, drifters, newcomers. Their deaths went uninvestigated, precisely because they lacked strong social connections. They were, in a sense, already ghost-like before they disappeared entirely. This pattern of predation targeting society's most marginal members continues to characterize many serial killings even today. The last known photograph of the Blackwood sisters was taken in 1874 at a community gathering celebrating the completion of Fort Worth's first proper courthouse. They stand side by side at the edge of the crowd, not quite smiling, but looking directly at the camera. Agatha's hand rests possessively on Eleanor's shoulder. They appear unremarkable. Two middle-aged women in dark dresses, their hair pulled back severely, their expressions composed. Nothing in their appearance suggests what they were capable of. Nothing, that is, except perhaps a certain flatness in their gaze, a detachment that becomes apparent only when you know what to look for. That photograph hung in the Tarrant County Historical Society until 1957, when it disappeared during a renovation. Like so much else connected to the Blackwood sisters, it simply vanished, leaving behind only the story, a story that continues to resonate with uncomfortable truths about human nature, about hunger both literal and metaphorical, and about the capacity for darkness that may lurk behind the most respectable facades. As Fort Worth grew into a major city, the memory of the Blackwood sisters faded further. Streets were renamed, buildings demolished and rebuilt, generations passed. Yet something of their legacy persists, a cautionary note in the city's otherwise triumphant historical narrative. They represent the shadow side of the American frontier experience, not the celebrated individualism and entrepreneurial spirit, but its dark twin, isolation that breeds madness, self-reliance twisted into justification for atrocity. The Blackwood case emerges from a specific historical context. The period following the Civil War was one of profound dislocation and transformation. Traditional social structures had been disrupted, economic uncertainty was widespread, and the Western frontier represented both opportunity and danger. Women like the Blackwood sisters, unmarried and middle-aged, faced particular challenges in establishing financial independence. The conventional paths, marriage, family support, limited employment options such as teaching or domestic service, were unavailable or undesirable to them. Their choice of profession is also significant. Butchery was traditionally male-dominated, as were most trades that required physical strength and technical skill. By entering this field, the Blackwood sisters were already transgressing social norms before they began their criminal activities. They had stepped outside expected female roles and demonstrated a willingness to engage with the physical realities of death and dismemberment that most women of their era would have avoided. This context does not excuse their actions, but helps explain how they might have developed their particular pathology. The sisters existed in a social liminal space, neither fully integrated into the community nor entirely outside it. This position as outsiders, who nevertheless provided an essential service, mirrors the traditional role of executioners in earlier European societies, who were necessary but socially ostracized. The question of cannibalism adds another dimension to the horror of the case. While the victims were killed for practical purposes, financial gain through the sale of their flesh, the fact that human meat was consumed unwittingly by community members creates a disturbing communal complicity. Everyone who ate the Blackwood sisters' products became an unconscious participant in their crimes. This aspect may explain why the case was suppressed for so long. The authorities in Fort Worth had to contend not just with the sisters' crimes, but with the psychological trauma inflicted on the entire community. How does a town recover from learning that its citizens have been unwitting cannibals? The decision to seal the records, to demolish the property, to discourage discussion of the case, these can be seen as attempts to facilitate collective forgetting, to allow the community to move forward without confronting the full horror of what had occurred. Dr. Samuel Holloway, who served as the town physician during the investigation, left behind a diary that was discovered by his great-granddaughter in 1970. In it, he described treating dozens of patients for what he termed nervous collapse in the weeks following the sisters' arrest. They come to me with physical complaints, stomach pains, headaches, insomnia, but the true ailment is knowledge. They cannot unknow what they have learned, cannot unfeel what they have felt. Some refuse to eat meat entirely, others cannot keep any food down. They are haunted not by ghosts, but by their own memories. This mass trauma response suggests how deeply the case affected those who lived through it. It was not merely a sensational crime, but a fundamental violation of the social contract, a betrayal of the basic trust that allows communities to function. In 1903, A journalist from the Fort Worth Telegram attempted to write a comprehensive account of the case for the paper's 25th anniversary. According to editorial records, the article was completed but never published. The editor's notes indicate that several prominent business leaders and politicians had objected, arguing that resurrecting the story would damage the city's reputation and serve no public good. The manuscript was reportedly destroyed, though rumors persist that copies exist in private collections. This pattern of suppression continued well into the 20th century. When the official records were unsealed in 1952, only a handful of scholars requested access. Those who did reported difficulties in obtaining permission to publish their findings. Academic journals rejected articles about the case, citing concerns about taste and propriety rather than scholarly merit. It was not until the true crime genre gained popularity in the 1970s that the Blackwood case began to receive wider attention. Even then, most accounts focused on the sensational aspects of the story rather than its deeper implications. The sisters were portrayed as monsters, aberrations, rather than as products of their time and circumstances. A more nuanced understanding began to emerge in the 1980s, as feminist historians and scholars of frontier history became interested in the case. They placed the Blackwood sisters in the context of women's limited economic opportunities in the post-Civil War era, and examined how the rapid growth of Western towns created conditions in which such crimes could occur and remain undetected. The anthropologist Dr. Maria Rodriguez, in her 1988 study of the case, wrote, "The Blackwood sisters represent an extreme example of adaptation to frontier conditions. They identified a market niche, quality prepared meats, and filled it using the resources available to them. That those resources included human bodies reflects not just their individual pathology, but the dehumanizing aspects of frontier capitalism, where everything and everyone could be reduced to its use value." This interpretation remains controversial. Many residents of modern Fort Worth object to what they see as attempts to excuse or explain away horrific crimes. They prefer the simpler narrative: the sisters were evil, their actions inexplicable in rational terms. This view preserves the comforting belief that normal people, even under extreme circumstances, would never make such choices. The truth, as always, lies somewhere in between. The Blackwood sisters were clearly disturbed individuals who committed inexcusable acts. Yet they were also products of their time and place, and their crimes reveal uncomfortable truths about that environment, its anonymity, its materialism, its capacity to look away from suffering. In 2002, construction workers renovating a section of the Trinity River waterfront uncovered a metal box that had been buried beneath an old retaining wall. Inside was a collection of papers, heavily damaged by moisture but partially legible. Experts from the Texas State Archives identified the handwriting as matching known samples of Eleanor Blackwood's script. The documents included what appeared to be journal entries, though many were too degraded to read. One relatively intact page, dated June 1875, contains a passage that offers a rare glimpse into Eleanor's thinking. A says we must be more careful in our selections. The last one was too prominent, too connected. Better to choose those who drift, who have already been forgotten by the world before they reach our door. There are so many such men in this growing town. The war left them hollow, purposeless. We give them purpose. Their flesh nourishes others. Is that not a kind of immortality? More than most will ever achieve. This passage suggests that the sisters had developed a twisted philosophy to justify their actions. They saw themselves not merely as killers, but as transformers, converting the socially marginal into something of value. This self-justification allowed them to continue their crimes without apparent remorse. Another partially legible entry hints at tensions between the sisters. A becomes too bold. She speaks of expanding, of opening a second location in Dallas. I fear her ambition will be our undoing. We have achieved stability here. That should be enough. But she always wants more. More money, more respect, more power. The hunger that drives her is different from mine. This suggests that despite their apparent unity of purpose, the sisters may have had different motivations. For Agatha, the business aspect, the accumulation of wealth and status, may have been primary. For Eleanor, perhaps it was the act itself, the process of transformation, that provided satisfaction. In recent years, the Blackwood case has attracted attention from scholars in the emerging field of food studies, who examine the cultural and social dimensions of what and how we eat. Dr. Jonathan Meyer, in his 2016 book, Consuming Passions, dedicates a chapter to the case, examining how the sisters exploited the growing disconnect between consumers and the sources of their food. As society industrialized, Meyer writes, people became increasingly removed from the production of what they consumed. The Blackwood sisters took advantage of this separation. Their customers didn't question what went into the pies because they had already accepted that they would not know, just as modern consumers rarely think about the specific animals that become their hamburgers or chicken nuggets. This perspective situates the Blackwood case within larger questions about consumption and complicity that remain relevant today. How much do we really want to know about what we consume? At what point does willful ignorance become culpability? The site of the Blackwood shop has gone through multiple incarnations since the 1870s. After remaining vacant for decades, it was eventually developed as a commercial property in the 1950s. Since then, it has housed a succession of businesses, a hardware store, a law office, a restaurant, ironically, and currently a tech startup. Few of the employees in the modern building are aware of its history. Local ghost tour operators sometimes include the location on their routes, though they tend to sensationalize the story, emphasizing the more lurid aspects and inventing supernatural elements that have no basis in the historical record. These tours perpetuate the myth that the Blackwood sisters were somehow more than human, monsters rather than murderers. The truth is more disturbing. Agatha and Eleanor Blackwood were entirely human, their crimes all too possible within the spectrum of human behavior. They saw an opportunity and took it, adapting the skills they had to the circumstances they faced. That their adaptation involved murder and cannibalism places them at the extreme end of the spectrum, but does not remove them from it entirely. This is perhaps why the case continues to fascinate and disturb. The sisters were not alien beings, but women of their time who made a series of choices that led them down an unthinkable path. They did not arise from nowhere, but from the specific conditions of post-Civil War America, with its social disruption, economic uncertainty, and rapid westward expansion. In a sense, they embodied the dark side of the frontier ethos: self-reliance pushed to monstrous extremes, entrepreneurship untethered from moral constraint, innovation directed toward terrible ends. They were pioneer businesswomen who found a market niche and filled it efficiently, their methods disturbing, but their business model sound. This interpretation does not diminish the horror of their crimes, but places them in a context that allows us to see beyond simple categories of good and evil. The Blackwood sisters were products of their environment, responding to its pressures and opportunities in ways that most would find unthinkable. But that followed a certain terrible logic. In the end, perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the Blackwood case is how close they came to escaping detection entirely. Had the storm not damaged their property, had Samuel Hayes not noticed the cellar door, had Marshall Hutchinson been less persistent, they might have continued for years. How many others like them, one wonders, succeeded where they failed, their crimes forever hidden beneath layers of respectability and the community's unwillingness to look too closely at the source of their satisfaction. The case also raises uncomfortable questions about justice and retribution. By taking their own lives, the Blackwood sisters escaped legal punishment. Their suicides can be seen as a final act of control, a refusal to submit to public execution. Yet they did not escape judgment entirely. Their story became a cautionary tale, their names synonymous with hidden evil. Is this posthumous infamy a form of justice, or merely a footnote to crimes that can never be adequately punished? For the families of their identified victims, there was little closure. Thomas Kerrigan's employer returned to San Antonio without his employee, but with a story too bizarre to seem credible. William Murray and his family left Fort Worth shortly after the trial, unable to continue living in a place where such a fate had befallen Evelyn. They settled in California, where, according to family letters discovered in 2010, they never spoke of what had happened to her. As for the unidentified victims, they remain anonymous in death as they were in life, marginal figures whose disappearances caused barely a ripple in the societies they moved through. Their bones, mingled together in common graves, stand as testament to the disposability of certain lives in frontier America. In 2018, the Fort Worth Historical Society placed a small plaque near the site of the original Blackwood shop. It reads simply, "On this site in the 1870s occurred events that remind us of the darkness that can exist within ordinary lives. May we remember both the victims and the lessons their fate teaches us about vigilance, community, and the consequences of looking away from uncomfortable truths." This modest acknowledgement represents a shift in how the city relates to this aspect of its past, neither sensationalizing it nor denying it, but accepting it as part of a complex historical narrative. It suggests a maturity that allows for the recognition of darker chapters without being defined by them. For modern Fort Worth, the Blackwood case is a reminder of how far the city has come from its frontier beginnings. The bustling metropolis of today bears little resemblance to the rough cattle town of the 1870s. Yet beneath the gleaming skyscrapers and prosperous neighborhoods, the memory of the Blackwood sisters lingers, a reminder that progress and civilization are ongoing projects, never fully completed, always requiring vigilance. The Blackwood sisters served more than meat at the Harvest Fair of 1875. They served a reminder that civilization is a fragile construct, that darkness finds purchase even in the brightest times, and that sometimes we consume our own darkness without recognizing the taste. Their legacy is not in the lives they took or the flesh they sold, but in the questions they force us to confront about community, complicity, and the capacity for evil that exists within the ordinary. Perhaps the final word on the case should go to Eleanor Blackwood herself. In a fragment of her journal recovered from the metal box found in 2002, partially legible despite water damage, she wrote, "People see what they expect to see. They taste what they believe they are tasting. The greatest protection is not secrecy, but the human mind's remarkable capacity for self-deception. We do not need to hide the truth. Others do that work for us, pulling the veil over their own eyes, even as they consume what we offer. In this way, they become our accomplices, partners in a transaction whose true nature they refuse to acknowledge. This willful blindness is our greatest asset. Without it, we could not exist. With it, we can thrive indefinitely, serving up horror that is savored as delight." In those chilling words lies perhaps the most enduring lesson of the Blackwood case, that evil flourishes not just through its own efforts, but through our collective willingness to look away, to not ask questions whose answers might disturb us, to consume without consideration of source or consequence. It is a lesson as relevant today as it was in the autumn of 1875, when two sisters set up their stall at the Harvest Fair and served the people of Fort Worth something more than meat